So it's time to talk about free energy as an introduction to the matter and energy unit. As we get started here, we need to talk about the big ideas and the enduring understandings. Um, as usual, you can find your screen lectures there. If you want to listen to more of these, you can always find it there at the top of your chapter text. So big idea two is that biological systems, that's living things, utilize free energy. Free energy is energy that is available to do work. They also utilize molecular building blocks. Those would be things like atoms and molecules. And they do this, they need those to grow, reproduce, and to maintain a dynamic homeostasis. You know, homeostasis is the tendency to maintain conditions at some constant level. And dynamic means that it's ongoing. You're attempting to maintain that. So the enduring understandings that are associated with this particular unit is that growth, reproduction, and maintenance of the organization of living systems requires both free energy and matter. That's the whole first part of this lecture. And the second thing is that growth, reproduction, and dynamic homeostasis require that cells create and maintain internal environments that are different from their external environments. In other words, the inside of a cell that is floating in the ocean is different than the outside of the cell, which is the ocean water. That is the essence of life, that things are different inside the organism than they are outside the organism. The essential knowledge that we're going to pick up, this is the nitty-gritty. All living systems require a constant input of free energy. That is, we all have to eat or take in energy somehow. Plants obviously absorb sunlight. Animals have digestive tracts to consume food. Secondly, organisms capture and store free energy for use in biological processes. We do that by eating. Plants do that by photosynthesizing. And then next, organisms must exchange matter with the environment to grow, reproduce, and maintain organization. So it's not just energy. We also have to have matter in order to do our thing. Cell membranes are selectively permeable due to their structure. That'll be towards the end of this particular discussion. Cell membranes are selectively permeable. What that means is they let some things in and not others, and they let some things out and not others. And next, growth and dynamic homeostasis are maintained by the constant movement of molecules across membranes. So the reason cells that are like algae that are floating in a pond or in the ocean are different than the water around them is that they are pumping things into themselves the cells are getting what they need from the water around them. And by pumping those chemicals, they're making themselves different than the water around them. And lastly, eukaryotic cells maintain internal membranes that aid the partitioning of the cell into regions, and that's where we get all of our organelles. So let's go ahead and scroll up here. The first idea is the first one we talked about. All living systems require a constant input of free energy. We eat several times a day. Snakes won't need to eat but once every week or two. Basically, free energy is any energy that is available to do work, and it's generally stored in the bonds between atoms. Like sugar molecules have lots of free energy stored inside because they have lots of energy that is available to do work. The order within an organism, that is the chemicals, the organization, bones, tendons, ligaments, blood vessels, etc., that's all maintained by a constant inward flow of energy. And without the energy input, we obviously starve to death and die because we can't maintain our internal structure. Organisms do not violate the rules of chemistry, they follow them. The two laws of thermodynamics that describe chemistry, energetics, are one, energy cannot be created or destroyed, only converted. So when we're converting electricity to heat, let's say in a furnace, or we're converting the potential energy of methane into heat in a furnace, or if we're converting electricity to light, the energy is not lost. The light just bounces around the room and then bounces away. It gets absorbed by chemicals and it's gone. So ultimately, living things don't violate these laws of thermodynamics, but they do take advantage of them. And the key is that all organisms, forgot to go over the second principle here. Natural processes tend to release potential energy and increase entropy. Entropy is disorder. Disorder is the messiness of a system. So it turns out that natural processes tend to maximize disorder. So if a house burns down, the chemistry of the house, which is organized sugar and protein molecules in the wood, is turned to disordered molecules flying around in the atmosphere, which are carbon dioxide and water. Natural processes in the universe that we witness all tend to increase entropy to a maximum. So organisms kind of try to decrease entropy inside of themselves. And the way they do that is by taking in raw energy input. So all organisms require energy input. And another way to look at this is the raw energy is used to drive endergonic reactions, which are reactions that require energy that could not otherwise occur. And by doing that, by adding energy to our system and doing these endergonic reactions, we decrease our entropy, but we actually increase the entropy of our surroundings. So that's an unusual way to look at probably the elimination of a meal by somebody who's eating lunch. But when you eat lunch, you're eating organized molecules. And what you do is you destroy the molecules internally, and you breathe out the remnants of the molecules as disordered carbon dioxide and water. But the energy from those molecules is what makes your body work and maintains the internal order of your body. So you do, all living things maintain internal order while destroying external order. Okay. The foodstuffs that animals consume are converted to carbon dioxide and water, increasing the entropy of the foodstuff chemicals. The energy of the foodstuffs is used to decrease the entropy of the organism and build internal cellular structures. Okay. Now, before we move, we have to talk briefly about these path of reaction graphs. So what you see on these two graphs is a story of a chemical reaction. The one on the left is what we call an exergonic reaction, and the one on the right is what we call an endergonic reaction. Exergonic reactions are where reactants are higher in energy than products P. So this is a reaction where R is making P. And as R becomes P, energy gets released. The activation energy for the reaction is the difference in the energy of R to the top of the energy hump. Do notice that R cannot directly go to form P. R has to be energized to a high energy level before then it can degrade and form P. This hump is called activation energy. Note that this graph is showing free energy, that's energy available to do work, versus path of reaction. So this is a map. The reactants have high energy, the products have low energy, and the hump is the pathway between the two. Now we look at the reaction on the right. This is what we call an endergonic reaction. On the y-axis, once again, free energy, which is energy available to do work. On the x-axis, we have path of reaction, which is the map. Notice that R, the reactants, are lower in energy than products. So this is a different reaction of R becoming P. And in this case, the energy hump is huge. It goes from down here at R all the way to the top of the hump. That's the activation energy for this reaction. This reaction right here is that this is the reaction that we like to do in our body to build muscle or make proteins or make DNA. So, but this is the reaction that is performed when we burn our food. So by burning things, we can actually get the energy out of burning things to build things. These are burn reactions. These are build reactions. The way the human body works in most life forms, you burn things so you can build things. By burning things, you take reactants, turn them into products, and the energy difference is used to actually energize other reactants to a high point so that they'll form products so you can build things. We'll talk more about this later, but it's very important that you understand that these two reactions are coupled to one another in all living systems. There's raw energy coming in some form that's being captured or used so that build reactions can take place, which are the reactions of building proteins, building DNA, building RNA, building big complex carbohydrates, which builds muscles, bones, ligaments, tendons, brain cells, etc., etc. So, lest I digress, let's talk now about chemical reactions. Each chemical element is made up of atoms that have properties due to the proton count. Now, we don't have to go hardcore into chemistry here, but that is part of biology, is to understand some chemistry. It turns out that atoms are little structures that are made of protons, neutrons, and electrons. They basically, at times, will exchange electrons with each other, and when that happens, we have what is called a chemical reaction taking place. In a chemical reactions, atoms interact and form new chemical bonds from their old chemical bonds. And then all chemical reactions involve energy changes due to electrons moving from orbital to orbital. Well, it turns out in living systems, most chemical reactions have very small energy changes. If they were big, we would burn up. In living systems, it turns out we have chemicals called enzymes, which allow atoms to interact in careful ways to make products. Each chemical reaction, and there are thousands that are going on in the human body right now, in your body right now, each of them requires a unique enzyme. We have over 25,000 different proteins. We make at least 10 or 15,000 different enzymes to carry out all the chemical reactions that it takes to make a human body. So, it turns out one of the things you got to learn in AP Bio is that chemical reactions don't happen all at once. Biological pathways like the Krebs cycle that you may have heard about last year, or glycolysis, they're actually a bunch of reactions that are tied to each other. We say that they're sequential. Sequential reactions are where the products of one reaction become the reactants of the next reaction. The products of the second reaction become the reactants of a third reaction, and so on and so forth. Glycolysis is a classic example of this. Glucose, by the use of an enzyme called hexokinase, is converted to glucose 6-phosphate. That's the first step of glycolysis. But then glucose 6-phosphate is converted to fructose 6-phosphate by phosphoglucose isomerase, which is another enzyme that's different than hexokinase. Fructose 6-phosphate is converted to fructose 1,6-biphosphate by yet another enzyme called phosphofructokinase. Then, in a critically important reaction, one of the more important ones we'll learn about this year, fructose 1,6-biphosphate is converted to G3P. Glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate is also called G3P. And the enzyme that takes care of that is fructose biphosphate aldolase. I could go on, but what I'm trying to show you is that glycolysis is a sequential set of reactions where the product of each reaction is the reactant of the next reaction. And by that happening that way, the reaction system is successful in that in the end it makes pyruvate. What's the advantage of this is that the cell can control what's going on and release little packets of energy that are capturable along the way. So this stepwise reaction sequence looks complicated, looks like overkill, but in actuality, it allows your cells to carefully control the conversion of glucose to ultimately pyruvate, which is mitochondria food, and along the way, pull energy out of specific steps where it needs to be taken out and stored. So we'll go more into this later on in this unit, but for right now, we need to go on to the generalities here. Each reaction that I just talked about has its own heat exchange, its own unique activation energy, it has its own enzyme, and each reaction is unique and unto itself. Okay, so glycolysis is 9 of these chemical reactions that actually make the whole thing successful. So I don't want to scare you at this point, but this is kind of a summary of what goes on in a mitochondrion. There are over 20 reactions happening in this region right here, and there's another 20 happening over here on the side, and then there's glycolysis that's happening outside out here, And all of that is part of the combustion reactions. If I scroll back up, I can talk about that. Glycolysis is this on the left. This is glycolysis. Most of the reactions of glycolysis are this kind of reaction. They're releasing energy. The cell is capturing the energy as it comes out so that it can then do these things in other parts of the cell. So the reason glycolysis is so stepwise is to capture all those little energy packets and move them out. So photosynthesis is stepwise like that too. Photosynthesis is endergonic. This is exergonic. Photosynthesis is endergonic in that light comes in to make all of these reactions take place. On the other hand, over here, sugar comes in and all of these reactions are exergonic. Okay, but more about this later. So let's talk now about how organisms use free energy to maintain organization, grow, and reproduce. Endothermic organisms, and by the way, the term endothermic in chemistry is the way we use endergonic in biology. The reason we don't use the term endothermic in biology the way we use it in chemistry is because for whatever reason, biologists use the term endothermic to describe the state of being warm-blooded. Ectothermic is the state of being warm-blooded but using outside heat sources to stay warm. Endothermic organisms use internal combustion energy to keep themselves warm. So let's start this over again. It turns out that endothermic organisms use waste heat from breaking down food to keep themselves warm. That's like us and birds do that. Ectothermic organisms use sunlight or some kind of external heat to maintain a constant or relatively constant body temp. Endothermic organisms like us, we either pant, dogs pant, they can't sweat. We sweat. Different animals have different strategies, but endothermic organisms have to do something to get rid of excess heat when they've overheated themselves. Ectothermic organisms don't need to do that. They just get out of the sun and then they cool themselves off. Endothermic organisms, when they're too cold, they shiver. And as a result, try to generate heat and warm themselves back up. Ectothermic organisms, when they get cold, they simply get inactive and they don't do anything until the heat is restored and they warm back up. So ectotherms and endotherms are what we call homeotherms. Homeotherms are organisms that try to maintain internal body temp. On Earth, right now, the main homeotherms are reptiles, birds, and mammals. But the reptiles are ectothermic homeotherms. The mammals and the birds are endothermic homeotherms. So let's look at these pictures down below here. The lizard here on the left is sunning itself. It's an ectothermic homeotherm, and it's trying to maintain warmth. The rattlesnake here, same thing. It's a ectothermic homeotherm. It likes to use heat. By the way, it's sitting on this rock probably because the rock is still hot from being in the sun. This is a dog panting. This is an endothermic homeotherm, and the dog's trying to cool himself because he's gotten himself too warm. Now, there's some important principles here that we need to talk about before we dive too far into this chapter. This graph is kind of important up here. This graph is showing energy consumption versus temperature. Now, on the left, on the y-axis here, we have milliliters of oxygen consumed per minute. The amount of oxygen your body consumes per minute is an indication of how fast you're burning fuel inside. Over on the x-axis here, we have temperature. So what we're trying to say is let's take the poikilotherms or ectotherms here. Okay, I'll talk about poikilotherms in a minute. Let's just talk about ectotherms. We see a linear relationship here, and it's almost direct in that it looks like it almost goes through the x-axis. What we're saying here is that as you increase temp, the animal simply starts consuming more oxygen per minute. That's totally true for an ectotherm. The warmer their body gets, the more energy they consume. So if you've got a snake in your bedroom and you keep the snake cooler, it might only need one mouse every 2 to 3 weeks. If you keep the snake warmer, it might need a mouse every 1 to 2 weeks. It all depends on how or the temperature at which you house the animal. On the other hand, endotherms within a certain range tend to consume the same amount of oxygen. In other words, we burn at a fairly constant level despite the temperature change. So from going from low temp to high temp, the endotherm is sort of flatline in that it's burning the same amount of fuel. Now, if you get to an extreme high temp, and I've got this graph wrong. The amount of milliliters of oxygen, well, actually, the amount of combustion that goes on will taper off, and I'll have to change this graph online. And in extremely cold conditions, the graph will taper up, and the reason is the shivering that goes on to try to maintain the internal body temp goes up if the animal gets too cold. So when an endotherm gets super cold and it's in danger of losing its internal homeostatic temperature, it'll start running or doing something. In other words, it will increase burn to increase body temp and keep itself warm. Whereas if it gets too hot, the endotherm will actually be laying on the ground in the shade somewhere, barely moving, because it's barely burning any fuel per minute, and it's still on the verge of overheating because probably there's just too much heat around it. So I'll have to fix this graph. So by the time you get to see this online, when you look it up, the graph will be changed. So that now allows us to move on to the next topic, the free energy that we need to talk about here. Free energy is needed for reproduction. Oh, I need my pen. Free energy is needed for reproduction. These crested pigeons are the male's doing a mating display. He's actually mooning the female and fanning his feathers out. She then looks at his feathers and assesses his reproductive fitness and decides whether or not she's going to mate with him. The walnut here's got all kinds of free energy stored in it that was stored by the leaves that was passed through this stem into the walnut. When that walnut falls on the ground, the seedling will use the free energy from the parent plant to try and grow. Furthermore, plants and animals mating, plants flower and animals mate at specific times of the year so that their offspring will be born when there's enough free energy available to allow them to live. Deer, for example, will mate in November. The females will give birth in June, just when there's a lot of abundant foliage on the ground for the fawns to eat. If babies were born in the winter, the fawns would die because they would starve to death. There's really not enough to eat then. And same thing for walnuts. The walnuts are falling late in the year so that they will, over winter, they'll get cold. And then in the following spring, they can begin growth and generate a new walnut tree. Now, kind of a confusing topic, but one we need to talk about. It turns out that tiny little animals like shrews burn less energy totally than elephants, but when you count in the weight of the shrew and use it as a ratio of the metabolic rate, it turns out the shrew per gram of body mass is actually burning more fuel than the elephant. Okay? Let's talk about this for a second. This graph is showing metabolic rate, that is just the amount of oxygen you're consuming per hour versus the mass of the animal. It turns out shrews, they're really little. They're they're smaller than mice, but they're ferocious little beasties with like a dog mouth. They eat bugs and little snakes and things. The shrew, being really tiny, doesn't breathe much air and doesn't consume much oxygen. The elephant, being really, really big, consumes a lot of air and burns a lot of oxygen. Okay? Now, if we consider now a different way to look at this, and we look at basal metabolic rate in the amount of oxygen the animal is consuming per gram per hour, and compare then the animals by mass. In other words, by animal mass, the shrew weighs only like between 0.01 and 0.1 kilograms. The elephant weighs over 100 kilograms. If we just compare the animals based on their mass like we did here, but now we're actually looking at their metabolic rate per gram hour, the shrew per gram of shrew is burning far more energy per gram than the elephant is. This is, we believe this is because the shrew is a very small animal and its cells are not well insulated from the external world. So, as a result, all cells have to burn fuel furiously to maintain a very warm body temp. So small animals like shrews and chickadees and sparrows, They have to eat a lot proportionately to their body size to stay warm, especially in the wintertime. On the other hand, the elephant is huge, and while the external cells of an elephant might need to burn fuel to keep themselves warm, the cells that are deep inside the body are extremely well insulated from the outside world, and those cells don't need to burn much energy at all in order to keep themselves warm. Just a little bit of burning will keep them just fine. So as it turns out, the elephant, because it is so thick and well insulated, it's got a massive number of cells that are insulated from the world, and they don't need to burn much energy. The little shrew, being not even a half inch to an inch thick, every cell is near the outside world, and every cell has to burn a lot of energy to stay warm. So these two graphs are two different ways of looking at the same idea. This graph is just looking at the amount of oxygen consumed per hour versus masses of different animals distinguished by mass. This graph is looking at the amount of energy that's being consumed per gram per hour versus the mass of the animals, and the shrew ends up being the winner in that case. We'll talk more about this later. So it turns out that free energy is not constant in the environment. It tends to fluctuate. A classic study was done up in Canada relating lynx and snowshoe hare populations back in the early part of the 20th century. And what researchers found is then that in some years there were really high hare populations. The hare population's kind of this red color, and you see it goes up, and then it comes down, then it goes up. And the lynx population kind of follows it. Now, by the way, it looks like the lynx and the hare are the same size. They're not. The population of lynx here is in the hundreds. The population of snowshoe hare is in the thousands. There's always more prey than there are predators. So it turns out that the lynx population is fluctuating with the hare because the lynx is dependent on the hare. It's not that the lynx thinks about this. It's simply the lynx litter sizes are determined by the food availability, and in years when food is scarce, the females may not reproduce at all, or they'll reproduce only one kit. In other years, when there's abundant prey, the lynx will reproduce more kits. You might ask, well, what in the world is causing the snowshoe hare population to fluctuate on a regular basis? That is determined by the food availability for the snowshoe hare. That's determined by weather patterns, which is climate. So as climate is good, lots of grass, lots of hares, lots of lynx. When the climate is drier and there's less food for hares, there's less food for lynx. So populations go down, populations go up with the climate. Ultimately, what this graph is trying to tell you is that predator and prey are intertwined based on matter and energy. It turns out the lynx population does limit the hare population to a certain extent, and the hare population is limiting the lynx population to a certain extent. Now, organisms capture and store free energy for use in biological processes. Now, I was trying to talk about this before. There's three general strategies we'll talk about throughout this course. Photoautotrophs are organisms that use photosynthesis to convert solar energy to potential energy. Photoautotrophs are things like plants and algae. Now, remember, photoautotrophs, and I think I mentioned this already once, photoautotrophs, all eukaryotes have mitochondria to convert glucose energy into usable form. So photoautotrophs use photosynthesis to produce raw foodstuffs, which then they burn inside their body in order to make energy available for the endergonic reactions of their organelles. So photoautotrophs are algae and plants primarily. There are some bacteria can do that, but the bacteria burn their foodstuffs in their cytoplasm. They don't have any mitochondria. Next is chemoautotrophs. Chemoautotrophs are truly weird, and we're discovering more and more about them. They use chemosynthesis to produce glucose. Chemosynthesis and photosynthesis are similar in that they both make glucose. The difference is chemosynthesis actually uses the combustion of often nitrogen compounds to power glucose production. Photosynthesis uses light to power reactions that create glucose. Chemoautotrophs usually are not visible to the naked eye. They're bacteria that grow as biofilms on surfaces in ponds and the ocean on rocks. They also are planktonic in that they float around in water supplies. Some chemoautotrophs live in soil. Actually, a lot of them live in soil. They break down the nitrogen compounds in urine and dead bodies. So chemoautotrophs we don't say too much about in this course. They will come up in the deep sea rift communities. Deep sea rift bacteria that consume the chemical fuel of igneous material coming out on the ocean floor. Those bacteria are the basis of food chains down there. They are doing essentially the same thing plants do, but they're doing it on the ocean floor using chemical energy. And then the last group includes us, heterotrophs. We have to eat raw foodstuffs and then we burn them in our body so that we can, build everything we need to build in our body. So this is a photoautotroph. The little dots you see inside the cell, those are chemoautotrophs. And then the amanita mushroom, which is the famous poison mushroom that makes a really famous ribosome toxin, that is a heterotroph. The mushroom is similar to us. It has to eat foodstuffs in order to stay alive. So now that brings us to the next topic here, the autotroph strategy. So what are autotrophs really doing? Autotrophs use the endergonic process of taking in sunlight to build glucose, but they use carbon dioxide and water. CO2 and water are the atoms that are stuck together with the bond energy of sunlight in between to make glucose. Waste atoms from this process are oxygen gas. So photosynthesis by itself is worthless unless respiration can take place to yield the energy in the glucose. Glucose itself is not actually usable by your organelles. It has to be burned in mitochondria to produce a molecule called ATP. The phosphates of ATP are a very versatile form of energy, and that's what all of your organelles run on. So now let's talk about the heterotrophic strategy. Heterotrophs basically have to eat foodstuffs. We can't make our raw foodstuffs. So heterotrophs have to eat things, which are usually food molecules which are polymers. What we have to do laboriously is cut the polymers with hydrolysis into monomers. And then we absorb the monomers, and then we either burn them or make them parts of our bodies. The glucose that we eat is usually broken down to release its energy. Some of it is actually used to convert to fat and then stored as body fat in your fat layer under your skin. Basically, we have all kinds of enzymes to make that happen. And in a bewildering picture here, if you can look very carefully at this, what looks like a ball, the ball is actually a glycogen molecule. This is the seed protein in the center. And what you see radiating out, each one of these tiny little units is a glucose molecule. So glucose, 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 glucose. These are all glucose molecules that are branching and radiating out from the seed protein in the center. This is how you store sugar in your liver and your muscle cells. If you start to run or exercise, the sugar molecules are cut off and immediately burned in your mitochondria to produce ATP energy to make your muscles work. So we'll talk more about that at another time, but that is mind-boggling that somebody actually created that incredible diagram. This right here, this molecule is each one of these tiny little structures in the glycogen molecule. In the picture on the right, we see the ATP, or the photosynthesis respiration kind of cycle. It turns out that autotrophs, which are the plants, the photoautotrophs and the chemoautotrophs, those guys are making organic compounds. You see this green arrow coming around here. That's these organic compounds like glucose. And they make oxygen waste doing that. These compounds are sucked in by heterotrophs like us, and they're used also by plants to be burned. Why? To use the energy to drive endergonic reactions that build our bodies. The waste products of burning this stuff is water and carbon dioxide. Water and carbon dioxide is sucked in by plants to actually be built back into carbohydrates and released as waste oxygen. So it turns out an animal kind of complements a plant, and a plant complements an animal with the products of their basic metabolic strategy. Do remember, though, plants actually also respire like animals, especially at night because there's no light. So now we scroll down and we got to talk a little bit about the ATP-ADP cycle. ATP is a molecule that actually is used by organelles for fuel. It's made in the body, most of it, by bonding a phosphate. Phosphate is P, double bond O, single bond O, 3 single bond O's. One of them is an OH. This is HPO4, 2 minus. Your mitochondria have an enzyme that stick this thing onto this thing here. This looks like a gun or something. This is a nitrogen base, a sugar and a diphosphate sticking off here. This is basically adenine nucleoside diphosphate. It's similar to like adenine in DNA. This is an ADP. So phosphate plus ADP forms ATP. Here's the phosphate. This phosphate is actually stuck on there to build that. You might think, why would a cell want to waste the time to do that? It turns out a mitochondria can take this ATP, pop the phosphate off, and use its bond energy to do work. Well, that's why ATP is such a versatile energy form. Glucose is not that kind of versatile energy form, but glucose is used to put this onto this to make this. The reason we eat sugar is to make this compound here, this ATP stuff. The ATP-ADP cycle is summarizing this. Basically, we burn glucose, C6H12O6, to convert ADP and phosphate to ATP. The ATP then is used by organelles for fuel. When that happens, the phosphate's broken off and it's ADP and phosphate again. Then we put them back together, the organelles take them apart. We put them back together, the organelles take them apart. And it keeps going around and around. Every time you lift your finger to do anything, you're cycling millions of ATP from ADP and phosphate back to ATP, and then ATP back to ADP and phosphate. You're cycling millions to actually move your muscles, to move your finger, or whatever you're trying to do with your muscles. So the ATP-ADP cycle is going to come up again in this unit. Now, the last thing I want to talk about here before we stop this section of the lecture and go on to the next is basic cell structure. We have not talked about cells in the AP Bio yet, but you did talk about them last year in regular bio. We have to do a quick update and refresher here on cell structure. Cells are the smallest unit of life on planet Earth that has basically the properties of living things. You know, they can respond to their environment, they take in energy, they have nucleic acid to store information, they have metabolism, etc., etc. Okay. The chemical fluid that's inside of cells is called the cytoplasm. Okay, that's the second point here. Cytoplasm contains the organelles. Cytosol is the liquid that's separate from the organelles. Protein catalysts, which are enzymes, are floating around in the cytoplasm. Some of them are stuck to membranes, and they accelerate chemical reactions. The organelles that are in the cell are floating around in the cytoplasm. The most important organelles for discussion in this chapter are the mitochondria and the chloroplast. The mitochondria is the primary energy transformer for all eukaryotic cells, protists, fungi, plants, and animals. The mitochondria basically converts energy of foodstuffs to usable cellular energy. Chloroplasts, which we don't have, basically are responsible for capturing sunlight and turning it into those foodstuffs by taking solar energy and turning it into chemical energy. So plants and animal cells have both mitochondria and chloroplasts, but only plants have chloroplasts. Now, The next part of this discussion goes into chloroplasts and goes over photosynthesis. So I'm going to save that for the second part of this lecture. So this concludes now the first part of this unit, which is free energy.